Life is real only then when I am. Introduction. November 6th, 1934. Child's Restaurant, Columbus Circle, New York. While I, as may be said, groaned and puffed over the last chapter of the third book of the second series of my writings, in the process of my subconscious mentation, that is to say, in my automatically flowing thoughts, the center of gravity of interest was concentrated by itself on the question, how should I begin the third series of books predetermined by me for writing? Namely, that series of books which, according to my conviction, was destined to become in a short time, so to say, edifyingly instructive for all the creatures of our common Father similar to myself. But here, I must sincerely confess that soon after I had chosen for myself the profession of a writer, as the most corresponding to my unexpectedly arisen physical state, and when, parallel to the improvement in my physical state, I clearly understood that, thanks to my personal written explanations, a great benefit will arise for the majority of contemporary people as well as for future generations, I determined by this very series of books consciously to acquit myself with great nature for my arising and existence, chiefly for an existence not merely as an ordinary life, automatically fulfilling some purpose necessary for the general realizations of great nature, but rather as an existence determinate and conscious, impartially evaluating itself, and in addition, gifted with the capacity of all-round perfecting and independent unity. The outcome of these recent reflections, combined with my conscious thoughts of today upon finishing this last-mentioned book, brought me to the categorical decision to begin this edifyingly instructive series of books with the description of the events connected with my last two visits to some of the cities of North America, and to cite in concise form the talks delivered by me there to a certain group of the followers of my ideas which had already been organized 10 years before during my first visit in New York. I wish to begin with this description chiefly because upon these talks, as I planned them in my thoughts, a corresponding foundation may be built for everything which I have decided to introduce into the conscious life of people by means of this third and last series of my writings. Furthermore, because of the publication of these lectures, combined with the description of the events and causes which provoked them, to which events and causes I reacted by means of these very talks of definite form and sequence, will, I have almost no doubt, create in their totality a, so to say, automatically acting factor for the possible saving from their total ruination of many thousand people of both sexes from various countries in Europe, Asia, and America. In this introductory book of the third series, I shall expose the quintessence of 5 talks, 4 of which were delivered by me at the end of 1930 and the beginning of 1931, and 1 other at the end of 1931 or the beginning of 1932. For the readers of this series of my expositions, no matter in which degree of consciousness they may rank themselves, it would not, in my opinion, be superfluous to know, among other things, from which of my conceptions and instinctive suppositions was derived the phrase I used, consciously to acquit myself with great nature. This phrase burst forth from me almost involuntarily and took a shape which derived from the totality of my instinctive and conscious conviction that by this act of making known this last series of my writings, I could rely on fulfilling what is, in my opinion, the most important duty of a man who has reached responsible age, which consists in preparing without fail for the benefit of posterity, according to one's own individuality, certain profitable instructions. Furthermore, I could by this same act, albeit quite subjectively, justify the sense of all my past intentional labors and conscious renunciations of all kinds of benefits, which are generally crystallized in the life of contemporary people, and which have always been very easy for me to obtain. And finally, I hope, in the moment of my last breathing, to experience with no possible mental, sensitive, or instinctive doubt the impulse sacred for man, which was called by the ancient Essenes impartial self-satisfaction. In order that there should arise in the mentation of the readers of this book, for a better orientation and an easier logical confrontation with what will follow, a something which existed on earth before the Babylonian civilization in a branch of science named theomathos, and was called a vivifying factor for objective assuming. I refer, of course, to the mentation of those readers who, as soon as they became acquainted with my expositions, were guided by and closely followed my advice. I wish first of all to try for their inner sight to depict by a verbal description various information, the totality of which might help them to represent in true perspective and clearly understand two situations which occurred in the process of my ordinary life during the time of my writing activity. The first situation arose just at the beginning of my writing activity, after the motor accident. That great misfortune which occurred to me when I liquidated everything connected with my previous forms of conscious activity for the welfare of those around me, and began to write. From that time on, I began particularly to avoid all kinds of meetings, and to shun conversing with people who had somehow become aware of my ideas, and also naturally wanted to speak to me in order to become better acquainted with them. I took this measure from the very beginning of my writing activity in order not to receive, or at least to receive in a smaller degree, the shocks upon my mental association of those rarefied abstract questions, concerning which, in recent years, I had been obliged in my talks with various people to adapt myself to their different degrees of comprehension, acquiring thus, in regard of these questions, almost an automatic response. I wished, generally, not to take in the impressions of ordinary life, which were unnecessary for me, and could interfere with the established tempo of my mentation in this task I had voluntarily imposed upon myself. To characterize my intentional inner isolation from those external impressions which hindered my writing activity, it will be enough to say that during this time I did not once read a newspaper, or even hold one in my hand. And it was almost the same with letters and telegrams. I say almost, because during this time I did read 13 to 15 letters, and wrote about 6 or 7. In spite of having received, particularly in the first year, hundreds daily. As the mention of such a free attitude toward my correspondence is a sort of confession of one of my secrets, slipped in involuntarily, I feel the need also to confess something else regarding the correspondence addressed to me. This would be in perfect accord with that fundamental principle of mine, always applied by me in ordinary life, and which is formulated by the words, "If one is on a spree, one must not stop at trifles." See the arousing of thought, Beelzebub's tales to his grandson. After my motor accident, already mentioned, making an exception only of the representatives of the French government, I closed the doors of my house to all people, both those who already knew me and those who had only heard about me and were curious to see me, probably with the aim, as most of them believed, of finding out for themselves what I was like and what my ideas were. When in the second year I was especially bombarded with big piles of letters, I commissioned one of the people near me to open these letters without giving them to me, and if there were no what are called enclosures, nor any indication of their immediate dispatch, to destroy them in such a way that not even their astral smell should remain in my house. But if there were enclosures, then, as I had the habit of expressing myself according to the number of English or at worst American zeros adorning them, to act in the following way. If 1 zero adorned the enclosure, then the letter was to be destroyed without residue and the enclosure given to the children living in my house for buying toys. If the enclosure had 2 zeros, the letter was to be given forthwith to my private secretary, and the enclosure to the kitchen administration on duty in the prieuré. And only those letters were to be handed to me personally, which were adorned with 3 or more of the aforesaid zeros. This arrangement of mine, by the way, still continues today. But in the near future, that is to say, the moment I finish this first book of the 3rd series of my writings, I propose to change this arrangement in such a way that all the letters and telegrams, without exception, are to be destroyed, and the enclosures with no fewer than 4 zeros handed to me, those with 3 to my secretary, those with 2 to the children living in my house, and all the enclosures with 1 zero will be sent to the poor children of the towns of Fontainebleau and Avon. Now that I have publicly confessed to such an unceremonious attitude not only toward my correspondence but also toward people, some of whom were at that time and perhaps still are considered in various European countries powerful and even illustrious, it will be right to say that if my consciousness allowed my particular nature to manifest such a boldness, and even to express it in written form, making it accessible to the perception of every 2-legged breathing creature, in spite of his representing, in the sense of comprehension, some geometrical figure such as a cube, square, or a zigzag, it is because I have already succeeded in fulfilling the greatest part of the task I set myself, in spite of all kinds of obstructive factors, both those which arose according to law, and those engendered by various types amidst us who unfortunately bear also the name of man, and who, as explained in a very ancient legend, arising and existing among us ordinary people, are usually formed by nature in such a way that 2 results ensue. Firstly, the cosmic substances transformed through them during vegetation, and not, as they themselves believe it, their life, serve as cathode elements for the maintenance on earth of objective good in the life of all humanity. And that, secondly, The elements composing their common presence are transformed after they perish to serve as supplement to the used-up products for the requirements of hell. Speaking shortly, this attitude of mine in respect of meeting and conversing with all kinds of people became, for the first year of my writing activity, firmly established in the course of my external automatic life. And I tried not to change it until several months prior to my last journey to America, namely when I had finished the exposition in its first draft of all the material which I had planned to write. The first series in its final form, the second in its first version, and the third at least partly written. The second of the facts I mentioned was that while the acuteness of my memory in connection with the questions of writing had become sharpened during my writing activities to an extraordinary degree, so that, for instance, I always could and even now still can remember where, in which notebook out of many thousands I have filled up, and in what connection with another thought, a particular thought is expressed and has to be repeated in a different form, and precisely in what other place, and could and even still can remember on which of the already tens of thousands of pages of the notebooks I have filled up, in which sentence, and in which word, there were letters I automatically wrote strangely incorrectly. Yet at the same time during this period when I unavoidably had to meet new people, there was scarcely a single meeting or even a single conversation which formerly would have unfailingly made an impression on me, which made any impression at all on my memory, and even on the next day, when it was sometimes indispensable for me to remember it, I could not, with all my desire and tenseness, remember anything at all about the meetings and conversations which had taken place only the day before. But when, due to nearing the completion of my expositions, the intensity of my inner preoccupation with questions of writing had diminished, there was acquired in my nature, which happens to be formed in a particular way, the possibility of being able, without experiencing a feeling similar to remorse of conscience, to take an interest in life questions other than those relating to the task set to myself for the given period, under a special oath, made in a definite state, which since childhood had been indicated and firmly instilled in me by my father. In this psychic state, I undertook to put the final touches to the second series, continuing to work, of course, as before, that is to say, mostly traveling in various European countries, principally in France, and being occupied with writing exclusively in various public places, such as restaurants, cafes, dance halls, and other kindred temples of contemporary morality. When from this time on my relationship with all kinds of people was renewed, and I began observing them again, due to my half-released attention, with a particular capacity intentionally developed in my early youth, and which consisted in being able not to identify with the external manifestations of others, I began to notice, and upon repeated meetings became more and more convinced, that in the psyche of all of them, men and women alike, who had some knowledge of and interest in my ideas, especially in the psyche of those who had already begun to attempt to make in practice some experiments on themselves, supposed to correspond to my ideas, there proceeded something wrong, so definitely all wrong that it was noticeable. Of course, with a certain knowledge of observation, even to every average person. These repeated constatations not only began to alarm me, but aroused gradually in my psyche the needful thirst for knowledge, for the purpose of understanding the causes of this fact. The result of this was that at subsequent meetings with such people, I began, for the purpose of elucidation, to observe them particularly and by means of indirect questions, to probe for more material, which might enable me to understand the origin of this strange and, for me personally, sorrowful fact. Each new meeting with such people, and even the associations provoked by recollection of this as yet inexplicable fact, on the one hand began to increase my interest and the thirst for knowledge to such a degree of manifestation that it became almost my idée fixée. On the other hand, the automatic thoughts about it began to hinder me seriously in my usual inner struggle with the lawful refusal of my nature to submit to my consciousness, and interfered thus with the possibility of my full concentration on the continuation of my work, which demanded the greatest attention. But when, finally, at the end of 1930, I arrived in New York, and on the first day I happened to find myself among a large number of Americans, followers of my ideas, and when I observed the same phenomena also among them, then this produced such a deep impression on me, and the force of reaction was so strong, that it provoked a cold shivering, similar to that which takes people who are afflicted by the so-called yellow malaria of Kushka. I then, even to throw dust into their eyes, increased my usual habit of joking in conversation in order to hide this inner state of mine from the people around me. After a pretty long time, when I grew calmer, and realized after a rapid meditation that for the fulfillment of the object of my present journey to America, which among other things was connected with the financial question, it would be possible for me to manage without making use of this group of people, I decided while I was there, and after elucidating my personal contact with the people composing this group, all the details and the shape of the gradual formation within their individuality of this original psychic peculiarity, I would do everything possible in order to uproot, if not from all, at least from the majority of them, this evil occasioned by the misunderstanding of my ideas, as well as some other causes, the nature of which I already half guessed. I must frankly confess that if such a strong reaction occurred in me, thanks to which I decided this time by all means to understand and elucidate from all sides the causes of this psychic peculiarity, and if possible to take all the corresponding measures, it was principally because in regard to people just of this group, long before, owing to their good attitude toward me during the hard years that followed my misfortune, there had long before gradually formed in me something commanding me to consider myself in certain respects under an obligation toward all of them in totality. Well then, as the description of the events following this decision of mine may elucidate to every reader among those who have become followers of my ideas the causes of the arising of this fact, maleficent in the objective sense, and for me personally, painfully distressing, and in order that perhaps some of them who have assimilated wrongly the essence of my ideas, and who continue to apply them to themselves, so to say, for their welfare, I refer to those in whom data for common sense reflection are not yet completely atrophied data, which are formed in the psyche of man during his preparatory age, may perhaps cease their, so to say, self-ruination. And furthermore, as acquaintance with the contents of the mentioned 5 talks, delivered by me amidst people belonging to this very group during my 2 stays in New York, which, by the way, were included among the measures I took for the rectification of these pernicious results, arisen through a misunderstanding of my ideas, may be, in my opinion, generally for every reader, the first flash of truth. I find it most fitting, as I've already said, to take the description of these events as a ground for the theme of this first book of the edifying series of my writings. On the first evening of my arrival in New York, the 13th of November, 1930, there was arranged, on the initiative of certain members of this group, it must be presumed pure-blooded Americans, judging by their ability to find ways of economizing time, a general meeting to enable them all to meet and personally greet me in one of the studios of the famous theater Carnegie Hall, to which I was invited by Mr. S. on the steamer as soon as it arrived in New York. Mr. S. was at that time the official substitute for Mr. Orage, who, thanks to certain conditions of ordinary life which were due principally to the misfortune which had occurred to me, became the first and chief representative of my ideas in America, and also the principal guide of this particular group of Americans, and who was temporarily absent in England. Most of those who had gathered there that evening were, as it turned out, personally known to me. That is to say, I had already met them either during my previous journeys to America or during their travels to France when they visited the Château de Prieuré, which in recent years had been my permanent residence. I went to this specially convened general meeting accompanied by several of my translator secretaries who had arrived with me. During the first greetings and the famous manipulation called shaking hands, I noticed in their faces and glances that same something that I had noticed among the people from Germany, England, Turkey, and other European countries, who had also somehow or other become followers of my ideas. Then arose in me the data already mentioned, which had even before then been forming about these Americans, and which after a little while brought me inwardly to the categorical decision, if it were not yet too late, to take certain corresponding measures for their welfare. At the end of the handshaking and the interchange of all the usual vacuous words called amiabilities, particularly used among Americans, I requested my secretary to read aloud the final chapter of the first series of my writings, which I had recently finished and which he had with him, owing to the established custom of always having in his briefcase all my current work. I did this chiefly for the purpose of creating thus the necessary conditions for an unhindered observation of those present. As to myself, sitting to one side in a corner, I began to observe attentively each of those present, and at the same time drew up in my thoughts a plan for further subsequent action in regard to all of them, as well as to each separately. On that first evening, as it was late, I interrupted the reader in the middle of the chapter he was reading, and, addressing all present, promised first of all to arrange a general reading within the next few days in order to finish that chapter, and went on to propose that they should choose 3 or 4 persons from among those present that evening, asking them to come to me in 3 days together with Mr. S. to decide collectively on the questions connected with my stay in New York. True to say, I made this invitation with the premeditated purpose, in intimate talk with these 4 or 5 persons, of sounding them out, of course indirectly, about various details which were not yet clear to me in connection with the suspicions which had arisen in me that evening during the reading. Suspicions in this case related only to these American sorry followers of my ideas. Expecting with indubitable certainty that this series of my expositions, as I've already said, will be really edifyingly instructive, that is to say, will serve, if only for the automatic formation in those creatures of our common Father, similar to myself, of data of all kinds, which ought to be, according to my understanding, present in a real man, and not only of such data which are generally formed in the common presence of people, especially the contemporary ones, making them quite will-less, manifesting themselves in every way like mere animals, exclusively through the reflexes of the functioning of their organism. I want, right from the beginning of this series, to speak also of such external facts, the description of which for a naive reader might appear at first sight almost a meaningless mere succession of words, whereas for a man who has the habit of thinking, and of searching for the sense contained in so-called allegorical expositions, on condition of a little strengthened mentation, they would be full of inner significance. And if he makes the slightest effort not to be a puppet of his automatic reflection, he will grasp and learn very much. As perfect showing material for searching and understanding the inner sense in the description of similar, at first sight, seemingly meaningless external facts, there may serve what I said then, at the end of the evening, on leaving the studio, where this meeting had been arranged by the Americans gathered there to wish me personally welcome. Walking out and pausing on the threshold, I turned round, and addressing myself to them in that half-joking, half-serious tone at times proper to me, I said, "Half and a quarter powerful gentlemen, and to the extreme degree powerful ladies of this dollar-harvest continent, I was very, very glad to see you, and although sitting so long among you this evening in the blissful sphere of your canned radiations, there did develop energy enough, perhaps even more than necessary, for actualizing my aim for which I have this time come here to you. Yet at the same time, to the great misfortune, I do not know, though, whether yours or mine, there was imperceptibly again awakened in me that impulse I have always had, but which never acted during the time of my writing activity, namely, the impulse of pity for certain people who have reached majority, and whose vanitous parents or tutors, profiting from the absence in these future derelicts in their preparatory age of their own wisdom, persuaded them, helping them with money, of course in a manner foreseen in Italian bookkeeping, to become in their responsible age physician-psychiatrists, in the present case for full-aged unfortunate people vegetating in American-scale organized lunatic asylums. To speak frankly, I am not yet convinced of the exact cause of the reawakening in me of this previously existing undesirable impulse. As yet, I only know that the reaction to these data began gradually to manifest itself, owing to the fact that during the reading of the last chapter of the first series of my writings. While sitting in the corner and observing out of boredom the expressions on your faces, it seemed clear to me that there stood out on the forehead now of one, now of another of you, the inscription, "Candidate for the Madhouse." I said out of boredom because the contents of this chapter, over each sentence of which I had to think and again to think for 3 months, almost day and night, bored me more than your fish called mackerel, which, during my first stay here, I was compelled to eat for 6 months, morning and evening, it being the only fresh food you have. After this, giving to my voice the tone which is taught in monasteries and is called the tone of confused humbleness, I added, I am not yet certain if it is really so, or if it only seems so to me, as happens often in the psyche of a man who has experienced a great many troubles. Owing to the 6 days of incessant pitching and rolling on the waves of the boundless ocean, and to the frequent introduction into myself of the noble French Armagnac, and the constant regulating of its vibrations by the introduction into myself of the no less noble German hors d'oeuvres, something in me is today, as it is said, fishy. Three days after the significant American meeting just described, days which the inhabitants there would characterize differently, those having many dollars in their pockets, no matter what were the ways of obtaining them, as passed with no monotony, while those for whom the absence of these dollars is chronic would say, the shortening by 1 more day of the approach of our last breath, the 5 aforementioned Americans came to me, headed by Mr. S. Conversing with them about all kinds of naturally flowing associations, and at the same time elucidating all the details I required concerning the suspicions that had arisen in me during the reading on the first evening of my arrival, I began to depict to them, in relief, all the already described constatations of mine in regard to the arising in the psyche of people, followers of my ideas, of this strange peculiarity, and the perspectives ensuing from this, and then, speaking briefly about the reasons for my present coming to America, and the impossibility for me to spare much of my time for the members of their group, I requested them to avoid what had happened during these days when, on account of visits of one or another member of the group, and their sometimes quite idiotic questions, I had not the opportunity to write a single word. I therefore proposed to them to form a kind of committee, and to take upon themselves the work of organizing twice a week general meetings of the members of their group, at which I would always try to be present, and also to see to it that on other days nobody should disturb me by personal visits, by letters, or even by telephone. After this, we decided together, in order to economize my time and also for many other considerations, to hold the proposed general meeting in my apartment, and in view of the limited size of the largest room there, which was a kind of hall, not to admit to these meetings more than 50 persons, and for the remaining members of the group to arrange meetings in the studios of Carnegie Hall or in other private rooms, where, without mine necessarily being present, there should be read aloud by one of my translator secretaries everything taken down in shorthand of the questions that had been asked me, and my answers to them. As a conclusion, I begged them as yet not to tell anything of what I had said that day to any of the members of their group, and added, according to the deductions after the observations and questionings made by me during these days, to my regret, I shall be compelled during my present stay in New York to take various measures toward many of your comrades, in order that either they should become completely disappointed in my ideas, or there should disappear the faith crystallized in their individuality during these years in regard to Mr. Orage and his authority.